I'd like to introduce Professor Alister McGrath to you. Unfortunately, Alister has to go immediately after his lecture and question time because he's giving a public lecture in Queen's College to start off the Christians in Science conference, which is following on immediately from this. And we've managed to capitalise on several speakers, including Alister, by juxtaposing these two events. Anyway, it's a real pleasure for me to introduce Alister McGrath to you. He was Professor of Historical Theology at Oxford and Principal of Wycliffe Hall. He was Principal when I was there, and I had the tremendous privilege of being taught by him. One of the great features of Oxford and Cambridge education is that you can be taught one-on-one even by a great academic. And that's a tremendous privilege. Alister started life as a scientist, studying molecular biophysics at Oxford, and then moved into theology and studied you were trained for ordination at Westcott, I think, yes, and here in Cambridge, and had a studentship here, maiden studentship of divinity at St John's College, Cambridge. And so he's done a lot of work in historical theology, written numerous books, but in recent years he's turned back to his roots in some ways, but with this great theological training too behind him, and to think about science and religion. And he's written quite a number of books now on that too. And in particular, he's engaged very seriously with the new atheism, so we look forward very much to having you speak, Alister.
Well, Rodney, thank you very much. What I want to do in this lecture is to try and map out the relationship between new atheism and science, ask what this tells us about the present state of Western culture, but also what it tells us about some important intellectual issues relating to science and religion. And having looked at the program for your conference, I think you will have touched on many of these themes already, and therefore you must forgive me if I cross ground you've already crossed several times, so I'll apologise for that in advance, but obviously I've got to make sure I do touch all the right bases here. I think the important point really to emphasise is that the new atheism really emerges in a particular historical context. And the context is that of expectations about what the future would look like around now. And really what we're doing is we're going back to the 1960s, and some of you looking around you could remember this quite well. For those of you who don't have that privilege, the 1960s was a period of great ferment and excitement, and there was this very strong sense that a bright new dawn was about to sweep across the Western world, and you had student riots, of course, in France, in the United States, and various things, and these were seen as symptoms of a much greater social upheaval, which is going to lead to significant transformations. Marxism was very popular then, especially among students. Many of you, again, will be aware of how big a driver that was in the academic culture of the 60s and 70s. Not so much now, but it was very significant then. And one of the points I want to emphasize is that there was this expectation that certainly in the West, religion was on its way out, both as a social presence, but also as a significant factor in private existence. And I think that this was the expectation. And what I want to say to you is that actually it hasn't really worked out like that. And again, those of you who are here from the United States, you can reflect on this. If you go back to the presidential addresses and the campaigns of the late 60s, early 70s, religion really isn't an issue. It becomes an issue when John F. Kennedy is a candidate, but that's because he's seen as a bit of an outsider, as a Catholic. But religion on the whole is not a big deal at all. If you look at the last American presidential campaign, both the Democratic and Republican candidates emphasizing A, their own personal religiosity, and B, why religion is such a good thing for America anyway. That's changed. And I want to come back to this because it does help us understand something of the background to the new atheism. And there's a quote from William Bainbridge and Rodney Stark, who in effect, writing back in the 1980s, was saying, look, this was the expectation. The most illustrious figures in sociology, anthropology, and psychology were of the view they'd lived to see the dawn of a new age, in which, to paraphrase Freud, the infantile illusions of religion would be outgrown. And there is a sense in which the new atheism is actually an expression of impatience or frustration. Why is this stuff called religion still here when it ought to have gone away long ago? And again, it's a very interesting question. Those who are historians, it raises the question of whether you can actually stand at one moment in time and say, on the basis of the trends we're observing, in a generation's time, it's going to look like this. Because actually, very often, it doesn't. There are just happenstances and contingencies that really move culture in very different directions. But I think there are some very important points to emphasize. And one of them is that this really is the springboard for the new atheism. The four leading representatives of the new atheism are Sam Harris, Richard Dawkins, Daniel Dennett, and the late Christopher Hitchens. And at least three of those began to write their manifestos on the day after 9/11. In other words, they saw this as a public manifestation of the irrationality and really potential danger of religious belief. So I think it's very important to appreciate how significant this was culturally. Someone like Richard Dawkins had been banging on about religion being dangerous for quite a long time, but it wasn't really taken that seriously. This event really shifted the plausibility structures. It in effect created a cultural mood that was sympathetic to the idea religion is potentially dangerous. Not just some sort of eccentricity we can tolerate, but something that might move us in very unhelpful and very dangerous directions. So I think this is one of the motivations for the new atheism, the sense that religion is dangerous. But of course, it is rather more complex than that. And if we look at these four figures, now I ought to project images of them because I think that will just help clarify one thing I'm going to say. But the first thing I want you to notice is that these are all male. Now that may not be significant, but I rather think it is. Because certainly there is this growing sense among sociologists that new atheism is a decidedly white, middle-class, male phenomenon. Now I personally haven't done any research on this. I look forward to seeing this in due course. But there are interesting questions about the sociological profile, if you like, the prosopography of this movement. But the thing that I think really is significant for our purposes this afternoon is that two of these are people who are interested in science, who know something about science, and who in effect see evolutionary biology as a significant driver for an atheistic worldview. And those are Richard Dawkins, who is an evolutionary biologist, and Daniel Dennett, who's really a philosopher, but is interested in evolutionary biology and thinking through its philosophical implications. And so that really gives us this way into our discussion this afternoon. How does science feature in the new atheist way of looking at things? Now, the fourth name on this list is Christopher Hitchens. Christopher Hitchens is a journalist, and he doesn't really know very much about science, but it's very interesting to read him and to listen to him when he does talk about science, because it illustrates quite well, I think, the popular perception of science and religion. And, for example, Christopher Hitchens would tell us that the medieval church, in effect, insisted the world was flat, and therefore that, you know, we couldn't kind of sail around the world because we fall off the edges. And I find myself embarrassed to say that because you've all read the literature which shows this is blatantly untrue. But what I'm trying to make is there is quite a significant gap between popular perception and academic opinion. I think that isn't a point that always needs to be re-emphasized in any discussion about science and religion. There is a popular level perception of things, which is actually quite deeply ingrained, and it doesn't really bear all that much relation to what scholarship is now telling us. And it does raise this very important question for me as an academic about the trickle-down effect of scholarship. How long does it take for new ways of thinking to filter down to people? And obviously the role of the media is quite important here. To give you one very obvious example, 2009 was a very significant year, 150th anniversary of publication of Origin of Species, and of course the 200th anniversary of Darwin's birth. And the media, in effect, as that year began, was really saying, of course, this is all about the conflict between science and religion. And the more nuanced and informed discussion of this didn't really kick in, I think, until about halfway through the year, thanks to people like John Hedley Brooke and others. But again, it reminds us that there are these popular perceptions, and the new atheism in some ways is playing into those. Sam Harris is a neuroscientist, or at least has a PhD in neuroscience, but that doesn't show all that much in his writings. He's more concerned with the irrationality, with the potential danger of religious belief. So what I want to do is to try and reflect on some of the issues that emerge here and where they take us. Richard Dawkins was very clear that 9/11 illustrated very clearly that religion is dangerous. This is an extract from an article he wrote for The Guardian shortly after that event. To fill a world of religion is like littering the streets of loaded guns. Don't be surprised if they are used. But I think that the core issue that underlies this, which makes this such an interesting discussion, is the whole question about the cultural authority of science and the cultural authority of religion. Are these, in effect, two colliding entities where one moves in and the other has to move out? Or are they different levels of interpretation, different ways of looking at substantially the same question? I think it is important to look at this, because certainly if you read some of the more popular writings of Richard Dawkins, his argument is that religious people are being invited to comment on certain questions which actually science ought to be answering. And so there is this issue about what the proper place of science is and whether scientific criteria should be applied to the whole question of beliefs, religious or otherwise. I'm going to be looking at that in some detail because I think it is a very interesting question. Because in effect it is a cultural question about who is entitled to speak on issues of meaning and value. And I think that you probably talked about this a bit already, so I don't want to talk too much more about it, but rather to move on and look at what I think is a very fair question, which is what distinguishes the new atheism from older forms of atheism. Now, as is so often the case, the name here given is not the name chosen by the people themselves. This is a journalist's invention. The journalist in question is a man called Gary Wolfe, who coined this phrase in 2006, trying to encapsulate his perception that the tone, the voice, the tenor of atheism had changed quite significantly, particularly with the publication of Richard Dawkins' book, The God Delusion. And one of the points we could make here is that in many ways, Richard Dawkins and indeed Daniel Dennett don't really make new points. They recycle older arguments, but there is something new, and it's the way in which these are presented. And I want to try and map out what some of these issues might be. One of the points that is very often made, and Gary Wolfe makes this point quite clearly, is that the new atheism is very attuned to media presentations of complex issues. The media isn't very good at presenting complex issues because really the idea is to present a simple headline, a simple storyline, a simple angle. And complicated questions don't really, work out like that. But the new atheism offered God as a delusion. Religion poisons everything. That's the subtitle of Christopher Hitchens' book of 2007. And these are sound bites. These are very good headlines. And you can see how this kind of way generated a media interest in the phenomenon. Indeed, some would say that the new atheism in some ways is media-driven. But nevertheless, these are very accessible ways of thinking. And later in this lecture, I'll reflect a bit more on the importance of rhetoric in relation to the new atheism. But I think one of the things that most scholars are beginning to pick up on is that it is the conviction, the aggressiveness, the confidence with which things are said that is one of the characteristics of the new atheism. Many of you will know that Cicero once said, "Nothing convinces like conviction." And, if you say something with total assurance, people on the whole, they shouldn't, but they do, are inclined to believe you. It's something our politicians have discovered. But the point I'm trying to make is that very often, simply saying something with great conviction sometimes masks the fact that actually there are quite complex, quite ambiguous questions beneath the surface of this which aren't capable of being reduced to these very simple statements. And again, that's one of the reasons where very often university professors do not make good public speakers on really important questions, because they're so good at seeing every side of a complex question. That's what they're trained to do. And in many ways, that is not what some media people want. They want a very simple, very slick thing they can write down in the back of an envelope. And very often, complex situations like the relation of science and religion just can't be distilled in that way. So I think there is an issue there which I'm going to explore in more detail. And I think that there is an issue here, and it's to do with irritation that religion survives. Let me tell you something about a lecture that the novelist Ian McEwan gave in 2006. It was a lecture to mark the 30th anniversary of the publication of Richard Dawkins' book, The Selfish Gene. And I'm sure many of you have read that book. I can remember reading it when it came out and being very excited by it, puzzled by its slight anti-religious tone towards the end, but I thought there were lots of interesting ideas there. But Ian McEwan was saying, well, of course, back in 1976, we all thought religion was dead. And it's bounced back. It's biting us. It was very, very interesting. He was really reflecting on not simply the cultural phenomenon, but its wider implications. And here is one of the issues. If you have a meta-narrative, a cultural story, which in effect is saying, this is going to happen, and this doesn't happen, it does raise question marks about the credibility of that story. And so one of the points I want to try and make here is actually there is a deep question here, which is the traditional atheist narrative actually wrong? If you read someone like A.C. Grayling is a very good example of this, someone who gives a very simplistic account of the development of Western culture. It's very much about the rise of science and religion, the displacement of religion, the growth of a whole series of virtues that are thought to be good for liberal democracy, and is presented as an essentially linear and continuing narrative. And one of the issues that we might just linger on here is actually the resurgence of religion as a major player in global politics. I think that Western Europe is probably the exception to this rule, and it's very interesting to ask why it's the exception to this rule. But certainly, this is in effect saying, look, the narrative you're telling might not be quite right. It might require tinkering with it. It might require actually radical surgery. We're not quite sure, but it's not quite that straightforward. So there is this element of uncertainty about where this resurgence of religion is taking us. And I think we can probably talk about that a bit more later. Another point which I think is really very interesting here is that if you read particularly Dennett and Dawkins, they have a very strongly modernist take on things. There is one way of looking at things. This is right, this is wrong. There's none of this nuancing that you find in more cautious postmodern approaches, which are on the whole inclined to say, well, you know, there might be several ways of looking at this, and we're not sure we can actually adjudicate between them, even though we can arrive at a personal preference for entirely justifiable reasons. So I think that is a really interesting question. Is there a link between modernism and the new atheism? Now again, you might go back to the historical origins of atheism in Western Europe. It begins to become very significant in the 18th century. Is this part of a broader cultural transition? Is it a cause? Is it a consequence? You know, there's some really very interesting questions there that I don't feel confident enough to answer, but certainly there are some very important questions. And the point I want to suggest to you is actually the survival of religion is, in one sense, a threat to the credibility of the new atheism. Because, if I could give a very simple example, I'm very happy to be contradicted here, but I would be surprised if there are many advocates of phlogiston in this audience this afternoon. Now, if you want to contradict me, do come and tell me afterwards. But the point I'm making really is that a lot of things just get abandoned and junked on the wayside because they're clearly wrong. I mean, we can understand why people thought that, but we know better now, so you just leave them to one side. If religion is so obviously wrong, why does it still have such a significant cultural presence? And that, I think, is an issue that really lingers here in the discussion of the new atheism. So again, trying to clarify what the new atheism is all about, it is, I think, helpful to try and develop, if you like, a taxonomy of atheisms. And I haven't really time to do this properly this afternoon, but perhaps we could just try and identify some points on the map. There are many people who would say something like this: I don't believe in God, therefore functionally I'm an atheist, but actually it's not really that I've thought these things through, it's just I don't really want to think about these things. It's almost like a disengagement, perhaps feeling discomfort with the whole question or uncertainty about where this might take you. But there are many people who in effect don't believe in God, but would say something like this: well, I don't personally, you do, I'm so glad about that. And it's seen simply as a difference of opinion which is potentially interesting, but nothing more than that. Then, of course, there'd be a more committed form of atheism, which is in effect saying, you know, I do believe that there is no God. In other words, it's not, you know, just I don't believe there's God. It's actually I positively believe that there isn't a God. And that is clearly an atheism of conviction, which is somewhat different. But it doesn't necessarily entail hostility towards religion. You know, I believe this, you believe that. Well, we can talk about this sometime, but we can live with this. The new atheism is, as Christopher Hitchens pointed out in a very interesting piece, essentially anti-theism. In other words, it is gunning for something. It is not simply, you know, we don't believe in God. It is very much we believe that those who do believe in God are mad, bad, sad, you know, this sort of stuff. And that, I think, is quite significant because it does help us understand the tone of the movement. There's this perception that religion is a dangerous thing and therefore that it requires to be critiqued. And one of the points that Gary Wolfe makes is that there is a tendency in this kind of approach, to use a football analogy, not so much to play the ball, but to play the player. I just want to, if I may, put two separate propositions to you. Here's proposition number one. Arguments for the existence of God are somewhat inconclusive. People who believe in God are deluded fools. See, one is in effect a statement about the intellectual situation. The other is an attack on those who believe in God. It's a people approach rather than an idea approach. And one of my concerns about new atheism is it does seem to be more focused on people than ideas at points. And that, I have to say, does concern me slightly. Gary Wolfe, I think, is well worth reading here, but he makes the point that the new atheism isn't really a sort of atheist liberation movement. Like, for example, gay politics. He writes gay politics is strictly civil rights, live and let live, but the atheist movement has no choice but to aggressively spread the good news. evangelism is a moral imperative. Dawkins doesn't merely disagree with religious myths, he disagrees with tolerating them. And then that really is from Gary Wolfe, who is actually quite sympathetic to what the new atheism is saying. So it does help us, I think, to locate this on a map. There's Greg Epstein, humanist chaplain at Harvard, just talking about the downside, the darker side of anti-theism, trying to make the point that this does, look at the final part of the quote, it seeks out the worst aspects of faith in God, portrays them as representative, it seeks to shame and embarrass people away from religion. So there are some points there that are really interesting. And again, if I had time, I talk a bit about some concerns for the New Atheist movement, about numbers, but also I think just look at a very interesting movement, which I think raises a very interesting question, and that is, how big is the social footprint of the New Atheism? And the answer really is that nobody's quite sure, because how would you go about telling this? What sort of parameters would you look at? But certainly Gary Wolfe, in this very interesting article naming the New Atheism, talks about the London Bright Sprite here as a sort of word for a secularist or atheist, being the largest and best organised group in the UK. And those of you who want to check up on this after the lecture, you can look at their website and you can see all their meetings, including what they talked about, how many people were there, and a kind of 1 to 5 scoring mechanism for letting you work out how good these things were. And certainly it's very interesting to look at this, because again it gives us a sense of what's going on at the social level. It begins September 2003 and chugs along quite happily. Then in 2006, 2007, attendance soars. And they meet every month. Before that, they've been somewhat occasional. And then they had this very interesting meeting with Channel 4 television there, talking about the future of the Brights in the UK. Now, it is interesting because the attendance figures are quite revealing. One of their meetings wasn't a great success. This was an invitation to go and see the film The Da Vinci Code. That didn't really grab people. But of course, the Channel 4 meeting, a public meeting to talk about this, attracted a lot more people, 33. Now, I just want to say to you, these are not big numbers. And it does raise this fascinating sociological question, which is, does atheism generate community? It's a very interesting question, because there are some who would say now that atheism is really more a private way of thinking than a sort of public movement with a sense of having something to celebrate, meeting regularly about, and so on. But of course, the final point I want to make is that yes, they met every month in 2006 and 2007, and then attendances went down still further, the meetings became infrequent, none in 2010, none in 2011, none in 2012. Last meeting, a comment, if the organizer can't be bothered to turn up, why should anybody else? And you have this sense that the fizz has gone out of this, that maybe it's been driven by novelty value. So that does seem to me to be very interesting. And again, we might look at this because it is a fascinating question. But my topic this afternoon is this. And what I want to do is to explore with you how science feeds into this. And really what I want to do is look particularly at the kind of things that Richard Dawkins and Daniel Dennett are saying, and try to work out what the issues are and where these take us. I'm going to put on the screen a very famous statement from W.K. Clifford, who is a Victorian mathematician actually, who died, I'm afraid, tragically young, I think in a boating accident. It is wrong everywhere and for everyone to believe anything on insufficient evidence. I'd like you just to look at that for a moment and ask you what you think. I mean, for what it's worth, I actually quite like this. I think he's right. But I do have problems with the last two words. What constitutes insufficient evidence and who decides? But the reason I'm putting this on the screen is that in many ways that's the kind of criteria of rationality that you find inside the new atheism. We have to be able to find something, to be able to give reasons for it. And again, we might just look trivially at a number of statements. And again, if you just look at these, I mean, 2 and 2 are 4, you can argue about that. A whole is greater than a part. Again, we're not really going to argue about that. The sun's about 93 million miles away from the Earth. Well, this is interesting because I haven't walked there, you haven't either. We're taking that on trust, but it is a kind of validated trust. It's not just we trust these guys. Actually, we know the methods they use, and we think they're probably right. But have a look at that final one. Democracy is better than totalitarianism, which I certainly share, and probably would imagine many of you would as well. But it's in a different category from the first 3. And the real issue is, does science take us to that point? Is that a statement that could be verified or justified at a scientific level? And the reason I'm just asking you to reflect on that is that there are many things that people believe in our culture which can't be proven, but are nonetheless thought to be culturally plausible. I'll look at some of those in a moment. I think that is a very interesting example of this kind of thing. And so it does raise questions about why people believe things, and that I think is important. I'm Irish, so I'm allowed to do this. If I cause offence to any Irish people here this afternoon, my apologies. But this is a very nice American representation of leprechauns. It's from a St. Patrick's Day card. I just want to ask, does anybody here believe in these things? Because actually, this is a slight evidential deficit here. These are beyond normal sensory mechanisms, if I can put it like this. So, if any of you do believe in leprechauns, I'm very happy to be very polite and very English, even though I came from Ireland. That's why we adopted some English habits. One of them is being tolerant towards views I think might be wrong. But I think I want to say, look, I just don't think there's any good reason for believing in these. But you can see how this actually moves us in some very interesting directions. Let's take Isaac Newton on the idea of gravity. And many of you will know how Newton came to this idea. You observe certain things, apples falling to earth, planets going around the sun. If there were a thing called gravity, that actually would make sense of these things. It's an inference. But of course, there is a slight problem here about gravity, and put it very, very crudely. It's a bit like leprechauns, and certainly we know that Newton himself was quite worried about this, because it did seem to make some sense of things, but actually, it was not something that in itself and of itself could be verified. Its plausibility rested in its explanatory capacity. And one of the points I want to make is that the new atheism has what I'm afraid I would personally regard as a rather simplistic take on things. Science proves things. There's no room for faith. There's no need for faith in science. Whereas religious people, in fact, run away from reality. And I think there are some very interesting points here. Again, you can see the historical provenance of this, W. Clifford's very interesting statement. But let's look at Richard Dawkins from The Selfish Gene. This is towards the end of the book, where he's in effect saying, look, scientists don't believe things because when the evidence is good enough, you know them. Faith, he writes, is a state of mind that leads people to believe something, doesn't matter what, in a total absence of supporting evidence. If there were good supporting evidence, then faith would be superfluous, for the evidence would compel us to believe it anyway. I want to suggest to you that this kind of way of thinking about evidence, beliefs, faith, is very characteristic of the new atheism. And I want to suggest that that early statement, that's 1976, is really quite interesting. And certainly, as a younger man, I would have agreed with that. When I was at high school studying science, that seemed to me to be the way things were. I took the view, a very simplistic view, I admit, but I was only 16 or so, that in effect science simply proved things And that was the end of the matter. What I think awoke me from my dogmatic slumbers was in my final year at high school. In those days, you wanted to go to Oxford, you did entrance exams in the first term. That left you 2 terms to kick your heels before you went to Oxford. I decided to read a little bit more widely, and I chose to read in the field of the history and philosophy of science. I have to say that by the end of that reading, that idea was dead in the water, because it just didn't make historical or philosophical sense. What I want to do is suggest that actually this is very, very integral to the new atheism. And it's very much a sort of what you see is what you get approach. Reality is limited to what reason and science can prove. But I do want to just look at that bit of the quote in particular and ask you if it really is right. If there were good supporting evidence, then faith would be superfluous, for the evidence would compel us, it's a very strong word, to believe it anyway. And I'm not sure that's right. In fact, I'm absolutely sure it's not right. First of all, there is a failure to make what, to me, is a critical distinction. Dawkins talks about the total absence of supporting evidence. But I want to suggest that maybe in real life, it's more about the absence of totally supporting evidence. And I want to suggest to you, those of you scientists in particular, that very often you are in a situation where there is lots of evidence, but the evidence is open to multiple interpretations. And very often it's not clear which is the right interpretation. And so I am skeptical about this kind of approach. I mean, we might give some very obvious examples. This is an Enigma machine, but as many of you will know, the German High Command were absolutely convinced that the Enigma code was unbreakable. And they used it to encode troop movements, shipping movements, and somehow their ships kept getting sunk because the British knew where they were going to be. And the Germans were unable, during the Second World War, quite to work out what was going on. It was a very complex picture. There were several possible explanations. The evidence wasn't good enough to lead them to the right conclusion, which is that somebody had cracked the code and was reading their messages. I want to suggest that in real life, we're very often in that situation of having multiple ways of reading what we see in nature, what we see in experience, but it's not always obvious what's right. I think that one of the points we need to make is that actually science, I think very appropriately, is better thought of as a journey than as a kind of something that's actually done its job and is finished. And inevitably this means that there is progress. What is believed today may be shown to be wrong or in need of reinterpretation tomorrow. And the obvious example to give is the massive shifts in cosmology in the last century. And again, you know, we have this massive debate going on at the moment. If we'd been here 100 years ago, the consensus broadly was the universe has always been here. That's changed. Or again, is there a universe or a multiverse? And again, you all know the state of play. There are immensely distinguished scientists on this side of the debate, on that side of the debate. And that's just the way things are. The evidence is open to different interpretations. It's not a question of proving or compelling anything. It's about opening it up to multiple interpretations and trying to work out what is right. And that, I think, brings us to what, to my way of thinking, is a very interesting debate. This is a debate that took place in 1948 on Radio 3. Those of you who know British culture, the third programme as then was, is kind of a very intellectual and cerebral. And they had Frederick Copleston, a Jesuit, and Bertrand Russell, an atheist, debate the question of God. And it was a fascinating debate, split up into different components. Copleston won the debate about do we need God in order to be moral, but he lost the debate about whether we need God to explain the universe. Russell, in effect, said, look, the universe has always been here. We don't need anything to explain it at all. That's just the way things are. End of discussion. And that was the way it seemed at the time to many. And again, as many of you will know, this was replayed in 1998 between William Lane Craig and the atheist Anthony Flew. Now, some of you will want to challenge me here and say, Flew, who died recently, was not an atheist when he died, and that is right. But he was when that debate took place. And Flew found himself discomforted by the possible theological implications of the Big Bang. And again, it sort of proved to be a sort of watershed in his own thinking. William Lane Craig won that section of the debate, not because he was a better arguer than Frederick Cobblestone, but because the whole way of thinking had changed. And it reminds us that science does move on. And I think is very important. If we time, we could look at the universal multiverse. But the key point simply is that these are ways of interpreting the evidence for which good reasons, but not compelling reasons, may be given. So again, going back to this way of thinking, which is very, very deeply embedded in the new atheism, I want to suggest that this is not actually particularly reliable. It seems to me this is something that really needs to be challenged. But of course, this is simply one aspect of the way in which the new atheism relates to science. Just to give you two figures from the wider world of culture, Terry Eagleton. We hold many beliefs that have no unimpeachably rational justification, but are nonetheless reasonable to entertain. It's simply making the point, look, there are lots of things that we trust, that we base our lives on. We can't prove them, but that's the way things are. Or Julia Christopher, again, a feminist philosopher, whether I belong to religion or be agnostic or atheist, when I say I believe, I mean I hold as true. In other words, there are certain things I rely on, and I can't necessarily prove that they are right. But let me now make 2 points about the new atheism that seem to me to be very significant, and both of these play into discussions you've already had. Number one, historically, the new atheism does perpetuate what is usually called the warfare or the conflict thesis of an understanding of the relationship between science and religion. And you'll see that, I think, most acutely in Richard Dawkins' book, The God Delusion. And you may know the passage I have in mind. It focuses on a writer called Michael Ruse, who many of you will have read. I think he's a very, very good philosopher who is very alert to both the historical and philosophical issues arising from Darwinism. Ruse takes the view that, although I don't think himself takes this view, that it is possible to be an evolutionary biologist and a religious believer. Richard Dawkins takes the view that there is total warfare between science and religion. Now again, I mentioned this point earlier, that seems to me to be simply indefensible. I put it no more strongly than that, but it is clearly something that he believes to be true. And that's one of the reasons why I think history is such an important aspect of the interaction of science and religion, because it helps us understand that sometimes debates of today, in effect, stand in the shadows of debates of yesterday and haven't always moved on all that much. But think yourself into a situation of total warfare. If it's science versus religion, and you are either a scientist who thinks religion might be a good thing, or a religious person who thinks that science might be a good thing, then the only place for you on a conceptual map is that of a traitor or an appeaser. And those of you who read Richard Dawkins' God Delusion will be aware he talks about the Neville Chamberlain School of Evolutionary Biology. Now, for those of you who are visitors to England and don't know about this interesting episode in British history, it is all about Neville Chamberlain, the former British Prime Minister who, back in the late 1930s, went to visit Adolf Hitler and came back waving a little piece of paper saying, "Peace in our time." World War II broke out 2 years later. But, Chamberlain was seen as being an appeaser. Let's stop Hitler attacking us by giving him certain things. And the metaphor is really quite strained. It seems to be that if you are a scientist and a religious believer, well, that is an unstable and indefensible position, by definition. And it's very, very strange in terms of the rhetoric that's being used. And so I want to suggest that the kind of intense nuancing of this question, which recent historical scholarship has introduced, doesn't really fit the new atheism at all. So I want to say that first of all we have this reliance on what for me is an outdated historical model, but secondly we have a very interesting understanding of the interaction of Darwinism and religious belief. Now again, you have dealt with this already, and so I'm very hesitant about going over this ground again, but from the standpoint of the new atheism, it is very significant that both the God Delusion and Daniel Dennett's book, Breaking the Spell, both appeal to Darwinism. A, to explain why people still believe in God, and B, to show that there are defensible alternatives. For me, one of the most interesting things, particularly about Dennett, but it's also there in Dawkins, is the way in which the word Darwinism is open to multiple interpretations. And I want to suggest that, that there are two of particular interest. One of them is the idea that Darwinism is in effect a provisional scientific theory, like every other scientific theory, which is open to challenge, correction, as time goes on. I don't regard that as being controversial. But if you look at the literature, you'll see that a second sense of Darwinism has begun to appear. And that is Darwinism almost as an ideology, as a grand narrative, as almost like I suppose you'd call it, a worldview. And this is a worldview from which certain metaphysical ideas like purpose, God, and so on are excluded as a matter of principle. And I think there is genuine confusion, particularly in the media, about these possible meanings which are very often elided. And that seems to me to be really quite significant. And therefore, I think it is important to note that this is very often a touchstone of orthodoxy within the new atheism. Richard Dawkins, for example, won't even debate people who don't believe in evolution. So there's a very interesting, almost like creedal dimension to the movement at that point. Now, as I've said, I'm sure that this has been discussed with you ad nauseam. I don't really want to go over this ground again, but I do want to emphasize that Darwinism is seen by the new atheism as corrosive of religious belief. And you might think of Dennett's book, Darwin's Dangerous Idea, where he talks about the universal acid of Darwinism, which corrodes religion, which corrodes all kinds of things. And one of my questions will be, just how much does it corrode? Does it also corrode the philosophy that Dennett uses in coming to that position? And again, many of you will be aware of this. It's a very interesting point, and early discussion of this is C.S. Lewis's essay, The Funeral of a Great Myth, where he's talking about the popular evolutionists of the 1930s, but he's making the point that if evolution explains reason as a sort of unplanned outcome, how can we then rely on that reason in trying to make sense of what we see around us? Obviously, his argument is slightly underdeveloped at points, but it is an interesting point. One of the issues that Dennett debates, I think very interestingly, is this. If you can offer an evolutionary explanation of why people believe in God, does that discredit the belief itself? It's a very interesting question. Suppose, for the sake of argument, that we were evolutionarily programmed to seek after truth. Does that invalidate the idea of truth? It's a very complicated question. Again, I haven't got time to really go into this in detail, but it's certainly there. And certainly some would want to ask questions about whether the new atheism actually is accidentally sawing off the branches on which it stands. That's particularly clear if you read Christopher Hitchens' book, God is Not Great, and I'll come on to that now because I think it's very interesting. Because it does raise the whole question of whether faith is irrational. And you'll be aware, I think, that Dawkins and others give us a number of examples to help us try and see that belief in God is a rather childish, infantile habit that you ought to break as you get older. And again, you may remember that in some popular TV programs, he talks about Santa Claus, Father Christmas, being a very good example of a popular or sort of childish belief which you ought to give up when you grow up. By analogy, belief in God is exactly the same. And again, it's a very interesting argument by analogy. It has a certain popular resonance, but it might be worth asking whether that actually is right. I don't want to privilege my own experience, but I personally stopped believing in Santa Claus when I was about 4 years old. But I'm afraid I didn't bother to tell my parents about this because I was aware there were certain fringe benefits to this belief. But you can see the point I'm trying to make. I mean, children don't innately believe in Santa Claus. They are told that by people they trust. And kind of way coming to discover the truth. I hope I haven't spoiled things for anyone. It's actually quite an interesting, almost a point of transition in many people's lives. But here's the point I want to make. Many people discover God late in life. It's not an infantile belief that is to be abandoned. It's something that very often comes to mean more or be discovered in later life. And that seems to me, again, to be something that needs to be there in the mix. But here's the real point I want to make. There is a big issue here about the new atheism and the idea of faith. I want to suggest to you that faith is not irrational. It's simply saying, I think this is right, I think I have good reasons for saying this is right, but I can't prove it. In other words, that you might begin to get technical and say, well, look, proof in a strict sense of the term is actually limited really to mathematics and logic. And those truths are doubtless very secure, but they're also somewhat limited in their application, particularly existentially. And so that seems to me to raise some very interesting questions. At this point, I think we do need to talk about the psychology of religious belief, and indeed the psychology of any kind of belief. And William James's essay, The Will to Believe, is, I think, something we still read with benefit, particularly because he has one writer in his gun sights, and I think you know who that writer might be. It is W.K. Clifford. Because William James is convinced that this is not just wrong, it's bad science. And he explains this. I think it's very interesting to look at this. His argument is that we need to make a distinction between avoiding error and discovering truth. And James basically is saying, look, Clifford helps us to avoid error by ruling certain things out. But ruling certain things out doesn't tell you what's right. It simply, in effect, maps out an area. You don't go, but it doesn't really take us there. Again, if you just want to imagine this or geographical analogy, you can say you rule out certain parts of a field and saying, that's not right. You're still left with a great patch of grass, and the right answer is in there somewhere, and you don't know where. But Clifford's real point, William James's real point, which he makes several points in that essay, is that we have to take risks. In effect, that's how science works. You say, look, I can't prove this, but I think it might be right. Let's work on the assumption that it is until something happens to show us it's not. He's emphasizing faith, risk in the whole scientific enterprise. and trying to make the point that as a matter of observation, science often comes to certain conclusions it can't prove, but nonetheless believes to be right. And that, I think, is a really quite helpful corrective to some of the things that we see around us in the New Atheism. And again, James, is very good on helping us to work out why he'll believe certain things. He talks about charismatic authority, the transfer of our trust in a person to their beliefs, and again, I think helps understand the impact of celebrity culture and what people believe. But I think his real point is simply this, that we have to take risks, and sometimes we go beyond the evidence and use some non-intellectual ways to come to a decision of what we should believe. And James used the word passional, almost intuitional. We have this deep sense, this must be right. But I want to suggest things are a bit more complicated than the New Atheism suggests. And let me just make a point here, which I think is interesting. And that is that, really, if we're talking about the relation of faith and reason, it's not simply about deduction. This, therefore this, therefore this. Induction is, to my way of thinking, a dominant methodology in the natural sciences, and that's much more about we observe this and this and this and this, and we ask what big picture makes most sense of these. And very often you generate possible pictures almost by matters of inspiration. And again, when I was studying chemistry at school, one of the stories we were told again and again and again was Kekulé and the structure of benzene. And you all know the story, but let me repeat it just in case it's new to anyone. Kekulé, puzzled by the unusual chemical behavior of benzene, it was much less chemically active than it ought to have been on existing models, and he, in effect, was staring at the fire one night and saw flames flickering and got this picture of a ring of flame and thought maybe benzene is cyclical, maybe it's a ring. What I want to make is that that has no bearing on the real world at all, but it gave him an idea he could check out. This distinction between the logic of discovery, the logic of justification. And again, I think it's important just to note how induction has come into this in a big way, where in effect we are looking at really the question of empirical fit. And again, Richard Dawkins does this. I think there's a very good quote from his book River Out of Eden. Many of you will recognize this. The universe we observe has precisely the properties we expect. If there is no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but blind chaos and difference, look at the structure of the sentence. The universe we observe, in other words, we look, and it's consistent with this. You see, it's all about a way of looking that seems to fit the observation. And again, on the other side of the argument, you might think of C.S. Lewis. I believe in Christianity as I believe the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else. In other words, the explanatory capacity of something is an indication of its truth. So I'm coming to the end. I won't talk about that, I haven't much time. Sir Isaiah Berlin is one of my intellectual heroes, not a scientist, very much an intellectual historian and philosopher, but in effect, arguing that really you can line up the things we believe and put them in three heaps. Number one, what you can prove by empirical observation. Number two, what you can establish by logical deduction. And number three, things you can't prove by either of those. And his point, very simply, is this. The truths by which we live mostly belong in that third category. In other words, there are certain beliefs that are determinative for us, but we can't prove that they're right. Berlin's point is simply that's the way things are, but he actually uses that to give a very powerful critique of the ideologies of the 20th century, which in effect thought they could prove that they were right. But let me end, if I may, with two people who I think are both very interesting and always worth looking at. One of them is John Polkinghorne, who needs no introduction, and I suspect that you don't even need to be told about that quote, which I think is both very good and very right. Science can throw up questions that point beyond itself and transcend its power to answer. In other words, there are limits to science. It raises very good questions, but lacks the ability to answer them. And that doesn't invalidate the questions. Richard Dawkins would, I think, disagree with this and say, well, you know, we're working on getting those answers. But others, I think of Peter Medler being a very good example, would say, no, no, these are permanently beyond the reach of the scientific method, because they're about things like purpose, identity, value, and agency, which are not empirical notions. But I mentioned C.S. Lewis. Let me just go slightly broader than Lewis and end with the chief rabbi, who wrote what I think actually is rather a good book. Well, his first chapter, I think, is rather good, on God, science, and the search for meaning. And I'm going to leave you with 3 quotes from him, which I think really are very interesting in reflecting on the relation of science and religion, but also on some of the issues raised by the new atheism, especially as these focus on proving what you believe. We can't prove, he writes, that life is meaningful and that God exists. Well, I think I put a tick against both of those. I think he's right. But neither can we prove that love is better than hate, altruism than selfishness, forgiveness than the desire for revenge. And you can add other things, like, for example, rape is wrong. From an evolutionary perspective, you could make a case for saying rape is right, because it kind of gets into the gene pool the fittest males. But, I'd want to raise questions about that. And he then concludes, almost none of the truths by which we live are provable. And this seems to me to really be a very good way of just saying one of the reasons why I think the dialogue between science and religion is so useful and so exciting is that we have 2 ways of thinking that are not so much in collision with each other. That's Dawkins' idea. It's much more that each is very good in its own areas, and we do need both. And for me, as a religious person, science says to me, why do you think that? Can you give me reasons for saying that's right? I know you can't prove it, but I want to know why you think that's right. But for me, as a former scientist, what religion says to me is, where do moral values come into science these days? Because science itself doesn't generate value. Again, Richard Dawkins and I disagree on lots of things, but when he wrote in A Devil's Chaplain in 2003, science has no means for telling what is right and what is wrong, I think he's right. But that doesn't mean we give up on the quest for the good life or working out what's right and wrong as a result. It just means we look somewhere else. And it seems to me that the science and religion dialogue gives us cross-fertilization and amplification of vision which otherwise you don't get. That's one of the reasons why I think New Atheism is simply so wrong. It has simply an impoverished and highly limited view of reality. And on that contentious note, I will end and we'll move into a time of discussion.
Great, thank you very much. Well, that's terrific, thank you very much. Now, over to you. We have some time for questions. Yes, Jennifer.
So I've always been very amused, in a sense, by why the public pays so much attention to what Dawkins and these 4 characters have to say, because there are many scientists who presumably have a large range of viewpoints on the nature of science and the nature of religion. Why is it that these particular voices are get so much attention? What does that say about the status of Western society, that they would be giving so much attention to these particular voices?
I think there are going to be some wonderful PhD theses on New Atheism. I think they're going to be sociological PhD theses, because it's all about not so much whether these ideas are right, but about the social impact, the way in which certain ideas bubble to the surface, the way in which the media pick up on certain things and not others, and trying to work out what the social mechanisms are that mean that one set of ideas get discussed I don't know a lot, don't I? So, I mean, you raised a very, very good question. I don't actually know what the answer is, but I will try and hint at some of the things that are part of the answer. Number one, as I was hinting at earlier, I think the media genuinely likes simple, memorable headlines. And the New Atheism gives you that. A rather more complex one, like religion is bad in some ways, but actually in some other respects is really quite good. And in fact, overall it's rather complicated. You know, that's going to go nowhere very, very quickly. There's no story there. As one of my journalist friends keeps saying to me, you know, I say, you ought to write about this, and I'd say there's a very good conference taking place about this. He said, there's no story there. He wants something that's going to generate attention. And that, I think, is a major difficulty we have to face. The New Atheism obviously generated a lot of interest because these slogans were headline grabbing. And that, I think, is not accidental. P.Z. Myers, who I just mentioned there very, very briefly, said, look, the old atheism was very, very boring. That got him a big bag of correspondence from old atheists who were a bit annoyed by that. And he said, look, what we need are snappy slogans that will grab people's attention. And I think, actually, he was right. That's a very shrewd judgment. The difficulty is, you know, when you keep on saying something, it does become rather stale. And people say, look, especially in the media, look, we've done that, we've got to move on, you know, and then they'll draw lines and say, we've done that, we're going to move on now. And actually, if you look at the way in which Dawkins appears in the media, it has changed over the last 10 years. You know, it's no longer the bold, brave scientist. It's much more, well, I don't want to be rude because it's being recorded, but it is a slightly more negative perception, which might involve words like grumpy or something like that, or you know, the militant atheist, which is how it tends to be introduced on the radio these days. There's been a change in perception. I don't really know why, and I don't think we can predict from it either. You know, I think what certainly has happened is that there was a perception, there was a cultural window of opportunity arising from 9/11. We were prepared to talk about these things and think about them again. And that is right, but it hasn't quite gone in the direction I think they thought it would. It has been that it's much more easy to talk about God today than it was 10 years ago. It's just that the conversations haven't quite gone. People said, you know, look, all right, we've looked at these ideas, not sure about them. What else is there? And kind of where they've begun to open up bigger questions, which actually move them, if anything, away from New Atheism. So I think it's a very complex picture. I don't really understand it, but it is very interesting, which is why I hope I live long enough to read these theses.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much. That was one. The problem I have with New Atheism is, in some ways I have a great sympathy with it, because what they're actually rejecting is an anthropomorphic God. You know, God made in man's image. And immediately you shift the debate and say, well, look, immediately you say that God is love or God is truth. And it was something I'd love to debate with Dawkins, because Dawkins would never accept that you presented a plagiarized paper to him, because he insists on the validity of truth. So if you say to him, look, if you call God truth, and a lot of authorities will do that, then we've got a point of agreement. So I really don't think that New Atheism is actually rejecting God. What he's actually doing is rejecting an anthropomorphic God. The second point is that, I mean, I'm very surprised what Oliver Sacks says about you can't prove the value of love over hate. Because one of the things I find in the work I do, trying to help people, either physical or you know, other problems, invariably when somebody calls me who's suffering from terrible pain, in 90% of my cases, if I say to them, what are you angry about? And they figure it out, what it is they're angry about, the pain will go away. So, again, we haven't got Oliver Sacks here, but to me, you know, that I find, especially coming from the Chief Rabbi, a very strange reflection.
I think the Chief Rabbi would probably just be saying, look, our experience may suggest or indeed even reinforce this, but we can't actually prove it. And I think at that strict level he probably is right. But certainly we could argue that there are good reasons for thinking this is the case, just as we think there are good reasons for thinking there is a God. And again, your first point is very, very good. I mean, if you think of the headlines resulting from John Robinson, you know, back in 1963, our image of God must go, is very much an anthropomorphic view of God, which I think the problem is probably the resting place of most of the British public, and that as part of the problem. But I was very interested in a quote I saw from Jeanette Winterton just this morning when I opened my Church Times. I read the Church Times as sort of penance. But it's very interesting. She was saying God is astonishingly religion-proof, by which she meant that actually, even though religion goes massively wrong at times, God somehow transcends its failures. And I thought that stayed with me. That struck me as being a very interesting thing that I want to take away from it.
Yeah, thank you. Debate between Dawkins and the Archbishop of Canterbury.
Yeah, there was no story there. The media were very, very clear. It was very sad.
Exactly, that was far too polite.
Yes.
Yeah, question at the back? Yeah, okay.
What evidence has New Atheism used to maintain that their meta-narrative has stayed consistent since the 1970s?
So I think that they would argue that in effect you have this linear trajectory, but it is being interfered with by people who have got all kinds of dangerous and nasty agendas. And they will talk about the religious right, they will talk about a number of people who are opposed to the Enlightenment, who are, Richard Dawkins used the phrase in referring to Karl Popper, truth hecklers. In other words, they're people who in effect muddy the waters of perfectly clear scientific thinking by in effect saying it's not that straightforward. And he's very rude about Karl Popper, which I find puzzling, because Popper is just asking questions which seem to me to be very obvious questions and very good questions. So I think what the argument is, look, this trajectory continues, but the problem is there are all these people who are messing it up by in effect trying to generate social conditions which in effect means that the trajectory gets knocked off course, something like that. And therefore, on that way of thinking, you would have to say something like this. You have to say that the New Atheism would say that one of the reasons for writing these New Atheist manifestos is to, in effect, say we've got to resist this. We've got to, in effect, make sure we can resist any cultural pressure which hinders the advancement of this meta-narrative. And that would mean, for example, keeping religion out of public debate or public life or something like that, which will clearly make it easier to achieve these ends. So I think that, I'm not sure it's really all that clearly thought through. Especially, I think, in Christopher Hitchens. I don't know if you've read his book, God is Not Great, but the final chapter is basically, let's go back to the Enlightenment. And he portrays this wonderfully nostalgic picture of this golden age of rational thought. And you know, I've had sort of trancing, I'm almost tempted to sign up, you know, because then you sort of just say, just a minute, I'm an intellectual historian, and I mean, it's not like that at all. And the reason we can't go back to the 18th century Enlightenment is because we know that some of its views are indefensible today, and we can't do it. And yet here is this guy saying, let's go back before these guys derailed it. Let's go back to the source of all this and start all over again. I just find that puzzling. I think that it reinforces my perception there's a kind of modernism which is puzzled by this, what they see as upsurge of irrationality in Western culture. Now, I know what they mean, but for me it's not irrationality, it's a protest against the limitations of the rather restrictive form of rationalism you find in most Enlightenment writers. I mentioned Isaiah Berlin, and he actually has a very good way of putting it in one of his essays. He says that reason was thought to be a liberator, but it turned out to be an iron cage, meaning that actually it imprisoned people. And I think that's one of the reasons why postmodernity is there, because in effect it's saying, look, this isn't right. It actually limits us. Let's try and find another way of thinking that keeps options open. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes. Yes, far back. Yes, Daniel.
Since you brought up 9/11, I was thinking of one issue that might not have come up during this. And you took the advantage of 9/11 as stating or given reason for is the statement that religion is dangerous. But that really builds on the assumption that the 9/11 is based on religious belief and not something else. So what if it's something else that is really the reason for 9/11, and this new atheism is just a distraction from the real issue?
Thank you. I think that's a very fair point. I think I wasn't saying that religion caused 9/11. I was saying 9/11 proved the jumping off point, the springboard for new atheism, who presented this as a sort of religious event. And you're quite right that 9/11 has been discussed exhaustively in the media, in the scholarly literature. And sure, religion is in there somewhere, but actually, as you can imagine, it's now a much more complex picture, which doesn't make for easy headlines. It's all about a number of things, including American foreign policy, issues of power across the globe, the presumptions of the Western political mood, a whole series of things like that. In fact, you almost get the impression that there are as many ways of reading 9/11 as there are interpreters. What I can say, though, is that the new atheist interpretation of 9/11 has not secured long-term cultural traction. What I mean by that is that it is seen as it's best seen as a political rather than a religious event. And I think that while I understand entirely that new atheism saw this as being an ideal opportunity for beginning to raise some very, I think, fair questions, I think that most people would now say, well, I don't think 9/11 is quite that straightforward. There are other things there as well. So that, again, I think would be about a dilution of the rhetoric of the new atheism. And I think actually things have moved on quite a lot since then. But certainly, that memory lingers for some people. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Yes.
Will the new atheism diminish without the church doing something about it? Or if the church has to do something about it, how do you propose we go about engaging with new atheism, knowing that there are varying strands, phases, and persuasions within the church itself?
I think that's a very good question. And again, it's very hard to give a reliable answer. My impression is that the new atheism actually ultimately is parasitic on certain forms of religious extremism and certain forms of religious irrationality. Because those, in effect, generate the pressure. And again, I was thinking of this when I watched Richard Dawkins' program, The Root of All Evil, which it was not a very good program, at least in terms of factual analysis. In terms of entertainment, it was really quite amusing. But you may remember, he began with a number of interviews with religious leaders, and these people were quite strange. And actually, I began to wonder at one point if they'd all been in Britain, whether they'd been certified under the Mental Health Act, because they were clearly rather exotic people. But the point is that these people were being portrayed as representative. And that really is the problem. It's very, very easy to portray the pathological as if it's mainstream. And especially in England, where popular understanding of religion is on the decline, if you say something with great confidence and you don't actually know very much about it, on the whole you'll buy into that. And that, I think, is a cause for concern. And in many ways, it's a bit like American foreign policy and Islamic extremism. One causes the other, and then there's a reaction, so they both get notched up. And actually, that becomes almost like an ascending spiral, which is very, very hard to break. And I think that the short answer to your very good question is that as long as religious people do some very stupid things, the new atheism is going to be around. And rightly so, because that needs to be challenged. But William Temple, former Archbishop of Canterbury, back in 1932, I think made a wonderful point. He said, the real enemy of religion is bad religion. That's what the problem is. And I actually felt very sympathetic with his analysis at that point.
Alister, this is great, but I think even long before 9/11, Dawkins was comparing Roman Catholic nuns with the Bob Jones cult that massacred a whole lot of people in Guyana. and taking, you know, just equating all religious believers with complete weirdos.
Well, I think he was, but what I was trying to say in the lecture was maybe 9/11 gave enhanced plausibility to that. In other words, a view which might have been on the margins actually, at least for a while, became mainstream. So I think that it's a reminder that sometimes things happened. Do you remember Harold Macmillan's famous quote, you know, when he was asked why things had gone? So he said, "Oh, events, dear boy, events." You know, I mean, things happen, and very often they create a cultural shift, and that's when ideas begin to change.
Yeah, good, thank you. Yes.
Why do you do this? Like, what is the difference between you and Dawkins? Like, you present your ideas, he presents his ideas. So, what is the difference? Why do I need modern ideas? And I think they are really plausible. You say it's just.
Well, I suppose Richard Dawkins and I are both professors who talk about their ideas and sort of just become second nature to do so, I suppose. I mean, he thinks I'm wrong, I think he's wrong. I also think that the conversation is very interesting because there are lots of interesting points to open up, so I'm very happy to use this debate as a way of exploring some big questions like you know, the limits of evidence, how you actually believe certain things to be true when you can't prove them, things like that, which I find very, very interesting indeed. But of course, it's not simply about ideas. I think you're right about that, and indeed, one of my concerns is that the debate between a new atheism and, for example, Christianity is very often portrayed as if it's your ideas against my ideas. And that actually is very modernist. You know, that is locating the conflict at the level of ideas. Many people would say, well, actually, that's not really right. I mean, the real debates are at a deeper level. It's all about existential concerns, it's about narratives, it's about beauty, it's about a series of things like that. And actually, one of the things that you do notice is if you talk to people who come to believe in God and ask them why it is so, surprisingly few would say, well, I worked out this idea was right. It's much more about discernment of purpose or discernment of beauty. Here is something I want to embrace, or impact on the imagination. Here is something that so excites my imagination I'm going to accept it as true, even though I don't think I can prove that. It's much more complex than that. And therefore, I actually think that people like myself who do debate at the level of ideas actually are not very helpful, because we're focusing only on one level of a very complex issue and presenting that one level as if it's the full thing, which it's not. So I would have to say to you that, that while I do believe this debate is very, very interesting, actually, for an awful lot of people, that's not what the debate really is about at all. It's about something else. And that's much more about what can I trust? What way of thinking gives me personal stability and dignity? What way of existing lets me lead the good life? And these are related questions, but actually they're not really about ideas. It's about something deeper than that. There's a very interesting book by Roy Baumeister called Meanings of Life, published in 1993. And Baumeister is a social psychologist, and he's just saying, look, let us work out what any theory of the meaning of life would have to address. And he lists the things you'd have to look at. Who am I? Why am I here? What difference can I make? And when you think about those, they're not really about ideas. It's actually something beneath the surface. It's much more about non-empirical ideas, like meaning, value, purpose, and so on. And for most people, that's where the issues really are located. So actually, for an awful lot of people, these debates go over their heads. That's not where the real issues are for them. But the debate still goes on.
Thank you. David.
I wonder if you might comment on my personal experience as someone working in the field of evolutionary explanations of things like morality and religion, that there's a sentiment similar to some parts of John Lennon's Imagine, that if you get rid of religion, there's a notion of social progress, or things are going to be better, or much like you mentioned with the Age of Aquarius and things like a lot, maybe with the previous talk. But I'll just give one example. In 1996, you might remember in the Sheldonian Theater, there was a series of lectures called The Values of Science and Science of Values. And one particular speaker, a colleague of mine, Nicholas Humphrey, who, spoke on what shall we tell the children. And it was in one way just a general atheist, like let's get rid of religion, but it had a social progress subtext. Actually, much more than a subtext. Basically, it said he said if we teach our children about religion or we make them religious, we are being child abusers, essentially. And Dawkins introduced him, and then many of the people that I worked with patted him on the back afterwards, either verbally or physically, in a way they did to none of the other speakers, including Daniel Dennett and Richard Dawkins himself. And the reason for it, when we got back to the zoology department and everything, was because there was this notion of social progress embedded in the new atheist, if you will, message. So,
well, that is very interesting. Certainly that is the view that Nicholas Humphreys takes. I remember his Amnesty International lecture some years before that, which made very much the same point, that religious teaching is a form of child abuse. And again, that was headline grabbing. But again, it may have gained the sympathy of some. I can tell you it alienated many more. And I think that really, very often we only see part of the picture. And you see your colleagues patting on the back. What you maybe don't see is others saying, this man is danger. This is what science is. We don't want part of it. It is fundamentally illiberal. So there's a broader cultural conversation going on. And that actually is what I find so interesting. That again, I work in a secular university, in a secular department, which is actually dominated by sociologists. And they have views on the new atheism, and they have views in particular of Richard Dawkins. And they're not very positive views. And it's because they feel these are A, immensely simplistic, and B, they lead to intolerance. And again, that's a different narrative. It's not so much a narrative of progress, but it is kind of progress. And progress is all about social cohesion, respect for others, and so on. And they see the new atheism as being thoroughly hostile to both of those. So it's very interesting. I mean, looking back on the new atheism, they missed out on a lot of tricks, if I can put it like that. And I think it's interesting just to note how the conversation has moved on. There's no doubt the new atheism has, in effect, achieved social penetration in a number of areas, especially, I think, with some younger university students. But I don't think it's got staying power. And that's what I think is a really interesting question. Will we still be talking about this in a generation's time? I don't think we will. I think already people are just moving on, talking about other things. It's like, people talked about the Da Vinci Code for a while. Now, that's in the past. Something else is going to come, and that will be the big next thing. I don't know what it is, I'm afraid. But I think, we just have to wait and see.
Dennis has a point.
Yeah, I just want to correct one of the mutant. Actually, it was in our chair's question, because we're on camera, that it's the Jim Jones massacre.
Jim Jones,
and
not the Bob Jones,
Yes,
runs to the theological seminary. Quite, thank you, Dennis.
That was my correction point.
Yes.
I do have a point or a question as well. So it just seems to me quite interesting also that some of the language, you talked about is the cultural movement. So some of the language used seems to me quite characteristic of sects, of new religious sects. And I was thinking particularly of the language of accommodationist and so on. And when you go to sects, that is one of the big things that characterizes a sect, that you actually, if you talk to the people down the road in another sect or something else, you are an accommodationist. That's the language which has been used in, I won't mention names, but lots of different religious movements which have become sect-like. And I just wondered if you knew of any, since you're in a department of sociology, whether people have done any sociological research on the sort of sect-like characteristics of the new atheism as a sort of cultural movement, because I think there may be other characteristics which are a little bit like that.
I haven't come across anything recently, but actually before the new atheism blew up, I came across a very interesting PhD thesis in sociology about, in effect, certain scientific leaders who were, in effect, presenting a certain way of thinking about science and trying to work out what sociological models might be used. And her answer was, looking at Richard Dawkins in particular, the best analogy is a high priest. Here is someone who, in effect, defines what is clean, what is impure. Here is someone who defines the limits of acceptable belief. Here is someone who in effect has a position not so much of intellectual power as of cultic power. And again, what she was really saying was that there's a kind of new religious movement forming here. And this was obviously before New Atheism took off, but I've gone back to that since then and thought that's quite prophetic. But you are right. I mean, the language used, the rhetoric, though anti-religious, is religious in form. You know, it's all about the children of light, the children of darkness, except it's enlightenment. You know, it's very interesting. And that is there. What it lacks, though, is an object of worship. I think that is very, very clear. Maybe that's why they don't meet very often. I was speaking to a group of atheists about 3 or 4 years ago, and I happened to ask them what they were doing on Sundays, and they said, well, we're going to meet and watch a video of Richard Dawkins. I thought, well, maybe that is the object of their adoration, I don't know. But a community needs a centre of nucleation. There has to be something there to make people gather. And I mean, with atheism, you find these big jamborees, like the Global Atheist Convention and things like that. But on a quotidian basis, you know, there's nothing really there. And if they are there, they're very small. So I'm interested in this, but I'm waiting to see what others come up with.
Well, thank you very much, Alister.